Hey everybody, Don McLaughlin here for another episode of PurePower Radio, and so delighted and psyched to introduce John Beye, who's now down in Durango, Colorado. John is among our PurePower ambassador team. John, so great to have you.
Yeah, great to be here, Don. Thanks for taking some time today.
Absolutely. Likewise, I know that you're in the midst of a busy guiding season here toward the end of the summer. And we connected way back when in the winter at Bluebird Backcountry, a backcountry ski area outside of Steamboat Springs. And one thing led to the next, and there you are off on an expedition to Denali. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that Denali expedition. But if you could just introduce yourself, sort of your background in outdoor adventure and guiding, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, awesome. So I grew up in Wisconsin, and spent a lot of time on the lakes in northern Wisconsin in the summer. And both my folks are teachers, and so a lot of the summer months were spent doing big national park road trips out west as well. And so the outdoors has kind of been ingrained in me for a long time. And went to undergrad at University of Wisconsin, and pretty quickly after graduation found myself moving to Jackson, Wyoming, which was, I guess, the start of it all. Got introduced into backcountry skiing about 10 years ago now, and had done quite a bit of rock climbing back in Wisconsin at Devil's Lake. And all the pieces kind of started to fall together once I had the mountains in my backyard full time. And started pursuing professional pursuits in the outdoors, leading expeditions in northern India and the Himalayas, and in Norway doing a multi-sport kind of wilderness leadership development course, and then working with lots of students in the Tetons and in Yellowstone as well. And all the while, chasing my own personal dreams and kind of pushing things a little bit further and further. As you're probably familiar, Teton Pass has gotten more and more crowded over the years, and it's great to see so many people accessing the backcountry, but something about it that's so special to me is being able to kind of share those moments in the wilderness with your partners in a more remote setting where you're maybe not necessarily using the skin track that's been there for the last week and turning into a highway. And so in recent years, I've kind of been pushed more and more to find objectives and to chase wilderness in places that maybe not as many people are getting to yet. So Denali, I guess, was the big one this last spring and summer. It's always been on the list, and stars kind of aligned with some friends that I met at Bluebird Backcountry and some longtime partners from Jackson to head up there in late May.
Well, Denali has such a reputation. You certainly went to the furthest ends, and a very challenging one at that, which I definitely want to dive into. Since it's relatively fresh, right, for you. But that love of wilderness and the things you highlighted there, in terms of sort of getting off the beaten path and sharing that experience. What as you've gone further and further into your appreciation for wilderness and adventure, what are some of the things that really you find both light you up, but then when you shared that with other partners and even as a guide, what are some of the things that seem to keep surfacing in terms of where the real juice and reward is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a big component of that is just the ability and the necessity to unplug from the rest of the world. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've been managing a wilderness lodge in Alaska that's totally off the grid and enough internet to keep the business running, but no cell service. And so I've been able to achieve that disconnect in big doses in past summers. And the more that I cut out time to dedicated to unplugging, the more I feel like I'm able to tune into myself, and especially if you're out there with partners, being able to really foster relationships. I think the mountains and stepping out of your comfort zone and pushing physical and mental limits is good as an individual, but it's maybe even more powerful when you're doing it with with partners and with friends and family that you care about. So that's definitely something that lights me up. I think doing that and then being able to, a long time ago, a mentor had told me, as far as progressing in the mountains goes, it's good to have somebody that you are mentoring. It's good to have somebody that is on the same level as you, and it's good to have at least a mentor or two that you're learning from and gleaning information and skills and knowledge and comfort from as well. And so just that teaching and then the relationships that form when you're out there chasing whatever you're chasing is probably what lights me up more than anything else, more so than the summits, more so than the ski lines.
I love it. I love it. So as much a relationship development as it is just the personal pursuit of more and more adventure.
Yeah, definitely. I think at the end of the day, climbing mountains and skiing off summits and all that is probably a selfish endeavor to some extent, and so being able to really put the effort into the people you're with helps me justify it, and then being able to share those stories with others is also a big component to hopefully motivating other people to get out there and chase their own dreams, then maybe develop an ethic that they didn't have before and some sense of stewardship so that they take care of these places that we're all recreating in.
I love that. I love that. Well, it's a perfect segue because Denali was, as you touched on, it was sort of the next thing. It was a big effort requiring, teamwork to the nth degree. I can only imagine. So just if you would walk us through, what that's like in terms of, the initial idea and then sort of putting together a team. And then invariably, I'm sure, so much stuff comes up that you can never predict and plan for every single contingency. So what that's like.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, like I said, the idea of Denali has been on my list for a while. And the skills progression and practice, goes back years to crevasse rescue training, probably 5 or 6 years ago, to skiing Orizaba down in Mexico, which tops out at like 18,500 feet a couple of years ago to get some of that altitude practice. And so Denali is definitely not something you just jump into, or high mountain objectives are definitely not something you just jump into. And so it's been years of practice and skill development and avalanche courses and really familiarizing, and just time in the mountains, just familiarizing yourself with the mountains and with how your body works in them, and building partnerships and relationships with people that you can trust on good days and bad days out there. And then as far as this expedition goes, there were 4 of us on the crew. Jeff, I've worked with in Alaska for 6+ years. Ben was a longtime friend from Jackson that we've done a lot of big stuff together as well. And then Menno kind of filled our 4th slot. And he was just someone I'd worked with and lived with in just up the road from Steamboat in Kremling this past winter. And so we spent a lot of time together living in a house in Kremling and commuting to work every day, and started talking about spring objectives, and Denali popped up. Like I said, it's kind of been on my list for a while. It's been on everybody's radar for a while. And so early planning stages, we're just, looking at calendars, looking at dates, trying to see how feasible it was, gauging, are we talking about this? Or are we actually going to pursue it? And then we submitted a permit application in late February, I believe, and it was approved by early March. And so that's kind of like, oh, this is real moment. And so from there, it's, there's a lot of stuff written online, but it was mostly a lot of Zoom meetings between the 4 of us, kind of pooling gear together, and who has how many ice screws, and who, has a glacier rope, and does anyone have a 4-season tent we can borrow, and kind of collecting gear and putting that together and starting to build menu items and wrapping our mind around that. Cause really you're planning for, we planned for 24 days on the mountain as a worst case scenario. It was all of our kind of nightmare to think that, if you get stuck in a storm, which is often the reality up there, and you eat all your food, and then you have a week-long beautiful weather window, but you don't have food to eat up there, then your expedition shot from just lack of resources. And so we probably overplanned in that regard, but put in a lot of time trying to set ourselves up for success. And then got up to Alaska in late May.
And
I had no.
it sounds like, John, that's a multi-leg trip just to get up there. What's that like, going into Anchorage and then it seemed like you're in Talkeetna or somewhere else? What's that like?
Yeah, totally. So Menno and I we drove up to the Pacific Northwest and kind of squeezed in 2 weeks of volcano skiing up there, doing some more crevasse rescue practice, and I think we skied Rainier, Adams, St. Helens, and Hood in a week or so, just to make sure we're physically fit, make sure we're again comfortable on ropes, and
any of which would be a major accomplishment. So you just kind of roll those off the tongue.
Yeah, right. That it would have been a very satisfactory spring had we left it at that, for sure. Some of the best skiing of the year probably was on the volcanoes. But yeah, then left cars in Seattle and flew up to Anchorage, and that's where Menno, Jeff, and Ben all met each other for the first time, which I think, I had full confidence and faith in both them as humans and them as people of the mountains as well. But it's maybe a little loose to jump into a big objective with folks you haven't climbed with before. I'd climbed with all of them individually, but yeah, I mean, the human dynamic thing worked out great. There were no issues there, but they all met each other in Anchorage for the first time. Ben's aunt and uncle live up there, and so we had a Anchorage base camp for a couple days to, again, divide and subdivide gear and build out gear repair kits. And probably the worst day of the entire trip, spending 3 hours in Costco figuring out food and wandering around trying to piece that together. And then from Anchorage, again, super fortunate to have Ben's brother up in Alaska as well, and he had an extra car, so we were able to load things up into his car and drive up to Talkeetna, which is like a probably 3-hour drive from Anchorage. And then we had an advanced space camp in Talkeetna with an Airbnb where more packing and unpacking and redistributing gear and weighing your backpacks and weighing your sleds to try and maximize the efficiency that you're going to have on the mountain, and just trying to wrap your mind around, again, what we're physically capable of, what we need, and what's maybe just like a plush item that is excessive. And spent a couple days doing that. And then I forget the exact date that we were supposed to fly on the mountain. It was a Thursday in late May, and some weather moved in, so we didn't end up flying onto the Kahiltna Glacier until Sunday. But we felt, that was Memorial Day weekend, so there was a softball tournament in town that we got to watch, and there's the annual cemetery cleanup, so we hopped into a little bit of community work there and jumped into the Talkeetna Cemetery to help rewrite some gravestones and rake leaves. And there's a really beautiful mountaineering monument there, and we're able to give some love to that as well. And filled our time in Talkeetna as best we could. I think at the end of the day, if you're going to get caught in 4 or 5 days of weather, you might as well do it in town when the bar's open and there's pizza down the street, rather than sitting in a tent at 14,000 feet. So made the most of our time in Talkeetna, and again, more packing and repacking and figuring that out. And then by Sunday, there was a little weather window that I think was going to last a couple days, and so we were able to fly onto the glacier that day and kind of start the real climb.
Amazing. And then from there, are you sort of in motion, for as much as you can to try to take advantage of weather windows? What's the sort of progression to get up the mountain and then ultimately seek the summit?
Yeah, totally. So I think, on average, people say it takes teams 18 days to summit. Or maybe it's 18 days to summit or 18 days on the mountain, I think, to summit, with some differentiation there between guided groups and unguided groups. And, we'd done a lot of, in the early stages back, on those Zoom calls, had done a lot of trying to wrap our mind around the route and considerations there. It is, despite being so remote and despite being such a large objective, it is one of the 7 summits and the highest point in Alaska as well, obviously. And so there's a considerable amount of traffic up there. This year with COVID or last year they canceled climbing season because of COVID, and then this year numbers were a little bit less. I know, base camp on Mount Everest had a big issue with that early on in their climbing season, so I think that kept some people off of Denali as well. But so that's all to say that there is a pretty set route, established camps in the way that like there are areas that historically are more comfortable to camp in than others and are out of avalanche and ice fall risk. And so you kind of, we use those as checkpoints. It was ultimately our goal to try to get up to 14,000 feet, which is the kind of basin camp right below the summit proper, in under 7 days. If we had gotten up there in 7, we would have been, on top of the world. And we ended up doing it in 4, I believe. We got, from the airstrip, it's about a 6-mile skin across the lower Kahiltna Glacier to what people refer to as base camp at about 7,000, 7,400 feet maybe. And then from there, the next obvious camp is at 11,000 feet. And that's kind of right below the crux of the lower part of the mountain. A lot of teams will double carry that stretch, meaning folks will haul a lot of gear up to 11,000 feet and then return down to 7 and sleep that night and then have a lighter load the following day. We opted to kind of grin and bear it and loaded our packs and sleds and did 7,000 to 11,000 in one push, and then took a rest day at 11,000 feet, which happened to line up with really the worst storm day we had, which was great. We didn't get, our plans weren't interrupted by the weather yet. And then from 11,000 feet, we took 2 days to get up to 14. So that's when we did our first double haul, carrying things kind of up and around that lower mountain crux, which is called Windy Corner. It's just kind of a exposed traverse over some really large crevasses towards the upper mountain. Did our single haul, got to enjoy a nice ski down from 14,000 to 11,000 feet, spent the night, packed up the rest of our stuff in the morning, and then moved up to 14,000 feet from there, which is where we would spend most of our time on the mountain.
Got it. Just sort of acclimating at that point and then preparing for a summit.
Yeah, exactly. 14,000 feet it's incredibly beautiful. Views for days in all directions, and relatively protected as far as weather goes. Things certainly get a little bit gnarlier the higher you go. And then from the get-go, it was always our goal and our ski objectives kind of lined up with this, to summit from 14,000 feet to 20,300, the top of the mountain. And the reason for that is the lines that we were hoping to ski, either the Mesner Couloir or the Orient Express, kind of come off a different aspect of the summit that would feed you right back into 14,000 foot camp, as opposed to climbing up to 17,000 feet, which is more the advanced base camp, and then going to the top and then having to retrieve all your gear and be kind of a logistical nightmare. So it was always our goal to, be in good enough shape and be acclimated enough to do that big 6,000 foot push in a day, to summit and then ski back to camp. And so we took our time at 14,000 feet. There's a really fun community up there with a lot of folks either coming up or coming down off the mountain. There's a permanent ranger camp up there, and they provide daily weather reports. And on down days, we got in on a wiffle ball game one day, and it's just it's a fun place to hang out and a really neat place to be with a lot of like-minded individuals. And so there's also really good powder skiing out of 14,000 foot camp. So a lot of our acclimatization days were spent, skinning to different kind of features on the mountain. There's a spot called the Edge of the World, and there's the West Rib Cutoff and the head wall, and just a lot of good places to ski and get some turns in. And so we did that for quite a few days, and then finally had a weather window break, and we spent a day kind of hiking up the head wall to the top of the 16,000 foot ridge, which is kind of one of the more famous ridge lines up there, and probably the most aesthetic part of the climb. And got up there for practice and to get an eye on the route, and then took a rest day, and then we were good to go the following day to make our summit bid up to 20,000.
Amazing. And along the way, are you? I assume so much of it is ensuring that you're mentally and physically in prime position and condition to make the summit bid, because that is a big jump. So what's that like for you? And I know PurePower starting in early spring, you started to incorporate it. So what are some of the things that you noticed just in terms of the strain on you, and then how you experience PurePower as you were acclimating and training and really getting in prime condition?
Yeah, totally. I think we got one of the biggest variables up there is weather, and we got incredibly fortunate in that regard, which left us to basically, like you said, our mental and physical health were going to be our limitations if there were any. The mountain shuts down a lot of people on its own, but all of our weather days were in Talkeetna. So we did the kind of full spectrum PurePower routine from the get-go, and Menno and I had started earlier when we were on the volcanoes as well. Jeff and Ben were maybe a little bit skeptical to begin with, but were very quick adopters after the second or third day on the mountain. Personally, like having been doing the regimen since spring, and having had trouble sleeping at altitude in the past, I think the power down was imperative to how good we felt. And then the reboot as well was just, we felt great the entire time. By the time the day came to push for the summit, everyone was, the reasons we didn't sleep is because we were so excited, and the reasons we were like antsy is because there was so much enthusiasm and excitement, and we felt so good, we knew it was going to happen. We just wanted to get the show on the road, and I think PurePower is a huge part of that. And as and the group dynamic as well. Like I said, none of these guys had climbed together before, and so being able to build those relationships and foster them on the mountain, by the time we were at 14,000 feet, it was just natural to be checking in with each other and taking turns boiling water at night, and making sure everyone's on their A game so that all four of us could get to the summit. And that was a huge part of it too.
Yeah, what a difference that makes, right? Certainly in perilous conditions and expeditions like that, if one person isn't feeling well, right, it can be a limitation for the whole group.
Yeah, totally. And with a few mentors had said, have those conversations, have those hard conversations before the situation arises, right? So what if one of us gets sick at 18,000 feet? Are we all turning around? Do we feel good sending someone down by themselves? What's the strategy there? And so we definitely had those conversations, but come summit day, I think all of us were firing on all cylinders and just psyched to start walking uphill.
Love it. Well, it's so good to hear that everybody got into sort of that prime condition, because it seems like that's the difference maker, whether going up Denali or other trying things we're in day to day. How we're feeling physically and mentally makes such a difference, right, in terms of the outcomes that we experience. And so it sounds like you guys were really dialed in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of it came down to the training in spring and at Bluebird even, and a lot of it just is the experience that you've built over many years in the mountains, and kind of building a resume and a portfolio that'll set you up for success on day of.
I love it. Well, and then so summit day, what's that like? You make the summit and then an immediate ski down? Are you up there for a little bit? What's that like?
Yeah, our summit day probably looked a little bit different than most people up there. The vast majority of folks on Denali are not skiing. Park Service would call the trend towards skiing a disturbing trend. So we had that going for us or against us, depending on how you look at it. We were all psyched to be skiing up in Alaska. And then most people do summit from 17,000 feet. So they're doing a double carry up to 17 and then making a 3,000 foot push to the summit. Like I mentioned, the primary ski objectives kind of swayed us against that. And then 17,000 foot camp is just a pretty inhospitable place to be for a couple nights. And generally you're spending at least 2, maybe 3 nights up there if you're trying to summit from there. And so weather can kick up and it's really exposed, and it just can be like pretty uncomfortable. And so we figured, if we're physically and mentally fit enough to do it from 14, then we can forego the challenges that happen at 17,000 foot camp. And so summit day for us, we woke up at 7:30 probably, and got moving by 8. It's cold in the mornings, and so getting up any earlier than that is tricky. And it's also Alaska in the summertime, so you got plenty of daylight to play with. You're not fighting to get down before dark, because dark doesn't really come at the end of June or middle of June. And so got up to, we had the night before kind of created benchmarks and checkpoints to help us wrap our mind around, if we don't hit this spot by this time, is a summit feasible? If we don't hit this spot by this time, is our ski objective feasible? That sort of thing. And got to 16,000 foot camp quicker than anticipated, moved through 17,000 foot camp quicker than anticipated. From there, you're doing this big traverse they call the Autobahn, which traverses kind of a big snow and crevasse field that puts you up and over Denali Pass. And at that point, you're at about 18,000 feet. And then from there, it's, a pretty long slog to the final summit ridge at around 19, and then 1,000 foot kind of climb, and then just beautiful ridge walk up to the summit. And so, we took our breaks along the way, but moved pretty consistently and efficiently the entire time. Got to the summit well into the evening, 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and we're the last ones up there that night, which was incredible. Again, just such good luck and such good fortune to be up at 20,000 feet in the evening in Alaska, and have the summit all to ourselves, and we hung out up there for probably half hour to an hour, because we were all wearing Hawaiian shirts, and the weather was beautiful, and who knows if I'll ever be up there again. And so we were able to kind of soak it all up. I know a few of us shed some tears, and just had a great reflective time up top, and turned around and skied off the summit, and then started to poke into our ski objectives a little bit. A few days prior, we had kind of nixed the Mesner Couloir off of our hit list. And I don't think it got skied at all this season. It was just, bulletproof ancient blue ice, and wasn't getting covered by snow. And so, and you could, you're camping basically at the base of the line at 14,000 feet. And so we were watching conditions, and things just weren't changing. We had skied some stuff adjacent to it, and it just wasn't feasible to ski a 5,000 foot run on bulletproof blue ice after hiking for 6,000 feet. So we scrapped that. We thought maybe the Orient Express would be good to go. We had skied the bottom half of that run. Again, it's like 4,000 to 5,000 foot couloir, high consequence, no fall zones, that emptied right back into 14,000 foot camp. And we, skied the bottom half and got into some good snow to decent snow, good enough snow that justified us poking into it from the top. So we skied off of the summit, nosed into the Orient Express, and sat there for probably 30 minutes at least, kind of going back and forth. Is it as bad as it looks? Is that blue ice or just hard snow? Is that, what does it look like if you lose an edge in there? Going through all the consequences with, heavy backpacks, and having been on our feet now for 12 hours at elevation, and ultimately decided to play the conservative card, and kind of ski the West Buttress route back down, which still saved us a bunch of time because we were skiing and not walking. And there were pockets of enjoyable skiing on the way down, but all of us there's still something on that mountain that's going to draw us back in coming years. And I guess the real kick in the pants is that by turning off of the Orient Express and looking 4,000 feet directly into camp, we then had to traverse back around the mountain, get back to the aspect that the West Buttress is on, which added a few hours onto our day. And there's just the biggest drag. And then we get down to 16,000 foot ridge at twilight or at sunset, and everything's aglow, and the sun's kind of dropping around the horizon, and there's just the sky's lit up and all the mountains are just on fire. And it was this like perfect aha moment of like, oh, this is probably the most stunning and inspiring half hour to hour leg of this entire 2-week journey, and it's walking downhill with skis on my back. You've asked me that 5 months ago, and the best part of the trip is definitely going to be the skiing, but really this hour long down climb on 16 Ridge, not skiing, was just absolutely spectacular, and hard to put into words how beautiful it really was. And so got down to the head wall, and on our way down the left.
John, that's amazing right there, because so often, right, our desired objectives, our outcomes are what we're so wrapped up with, and yet it sounds like you had this experience of just realizing that what you were in right there was better than what you could have conceived of, and just to fully enjoy it, embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was just so breathtaking and so stunning, and you had this huge day in the mountains and accomplished. We didn't get to ski what we wanted to ski, but we all summited, and all the relationship stuff I was touching on earlier just kind of came together, and there's some critical moments of decision making and teamwork, and ultimately the rewards far outweighed what we could have anticipated or would have even considered. Like I said, walking down 16 Ridge wasn't even a plan in February when we started talking about it, yet it was just spectacular. I'll send some photos your way. It was cool.
On top of which, having the summit all to yourselves in the midst of summer in Alaska, weather sounds amazing. And I was so delighted to hear that Daily Boost sounds like it made it up. And what did you find from that? Was it just having some way to sort of recharge, or just regain your sort of calm focus? What was it for you that inspired you to bring Daily Boost up to the top of Denali?
Yeah, 100% that. We did the Daily Boost in the morning, and got through, like I said, 16 Ridge and 17 Camp, and then got up and over Denali Pass and hit 18,000 feet. And that's kind of really, I generally do well at altitude, but that's really when it kind of, you start to feel it, for me at least, and for the rest of the foot Ben and Jeff and Manos. That's when you start to drag, and you start to maybe get these inklings of, should we be up here? It's like certainly not a place that humans are meant to be. Are we doing this right? Is the summit attainable? And you just start to get in like a weird headspace. And so you had the Daily Boost on us, and did some at 18,000 feet, which personally, I won't speak for the other guys, but personally, just like you said, helped reset my mindset to more of a state of calm and a state of awareness, and just appreciation for the experience. And maybe that little extra whatever it takes to keep putting one foot in front of the other at elevation, and towards the end of a long day. And then and then at the summit as well, after that long haul from 18,000 to 20,000 feet, knowing that you're about to go skiing, and like really going to be doing some high consequence skiing. You're very remote setting, fighting, you fighting the challenges of altitude and of inconsistent snow conditions and heavy packs and all that. And so really making sure that we're in tune and fully wired, fully aware, fully prepared to tackle the descent, because ultimately that determines the success of a climb, is being able to get down again. So
you took very seriously, and it sounds like daily boost is a factor just in terms of taking that time to really assess calmly.
Yeah, like I said, we sat there for 30-45 minutes and we're able to, I think critically and take some deep breaths and be able to analyze and make the best decision possible, and then be okay with that decision as well, as we continue on our descent. Daily boost is huge with that for sure.
Love to hear it. And I assume you had tales to share with those back at 14,000, given you guys had the summit by yourselves. That must have been quite an experience.
Yeah, it was awesome. And on our way down that night, actually, we ran into a friend that we had met at 14,000 feet and kind of got talking on the last few hundred feet down to 14 camp. And he had skied off the summit as well just before us. And we're like, oh yeah, we thought we saw your tracks going into the Orient Express. And he had said, he skied the first 1,000 feet, jump turning on bulletproof ice, and ran into a rope team climbing up, placing ice screws. And he's like, oh, it gets better below this, right? And they're like, no, it's far, far worse. And so he ended up, adding even more hours onto his day. He climbed back up the Orient Express with those guys, and then did the same kind of wraparound traverse to ski out the same way we did, which, we had at that point had felt good about our decision anyway, but that was the kind of icing on the cake to really solidify that, bailing on the set objective was probably the right call. And then, got to 14,000 foot camp, and Sam, who you met at Bluebird as well, we spent a lot of time with him at 14. Our trips overlapped, and we were able to provide, they had very similar objectives to us with wanting to summit from 14 camp, and they were all skiing and snowboarding as well. And we were able to kind of give some beta to them, and they went up the following day and had a successful summit bid. All their team made it up. They all skied down the same route we did. But I felt like our team was really solid. Their team was incredibly solid as well. And being able to, throughout the whole trip, we were sharing weather reports and trading food, and our, last day at 14, we had a bunch of excess food, and like I said, we probably overdid our Costco run. So we threw a little happy hour charcuterie party with cheese and bacon, and for some reason some garlic stuffed olives made it up to 14, so we threw those in there, and lived it up and relaxed and had a great time at 14 camp before packing everything up the following day and wishing Sam and those guys good luck. And then we're able to get back to the airstrip, and again, with the blessing of skis, we did it 14 to 7 on the airstrip, pulling sleds in a day, a few hours, and get a lot of time to reflect and just soak up the last of the Alaska range before hopping on a plane back to Talkeetna.
Amazing. Well, bravo. Congratulations, John, to you and the entire team. It's just so inspiring, and, it seems untouchable for so many, but I think some of the, things that you've highlighted in terms of, assessing, what risks there are, working through them calmly, right? Pivoting when, you got to, right? And not being so attached to what you thought, and then discovering something even better that you couldn't imagine. I think some of the highlights and takeaways. So bravo.
Yeah, definitely appreciate that. And just, certainly a trip of a lifetime. I'd say it's not unattainable. I think, if you put in the time and the effort in this, how many beautiful, incredible mountains out there that are all going to have their own thing to teach you, and you start building that portfolio and those experiences, and pretty soon you're standing on top of North America having the time of your life. So
I love it. Amazing. Well, I know that there's future trips imminent for you to Glacier, so I'll let you go back to both recharging and getting ready for that one. And thanks so much for coming on and sharing your journey, John. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Don. My pleasure as well.